time to get started. And here we go. Hey, everybody. Good evening. 7 o'clock on this fine Wednesday night. Hopefully you guys are all doing well. It looks like the stream is up and running. We got about 14 people here, it looks like. So we're going to get started here in just a minute. I know some people are still logging in, so I'm going to give them a minute to get in. Just to let you know what we are talking about tonight will be, let's see if this works. Nope, didn't work. We're going to be covering 1898 to 1929, what I call period 7A. Period 7 technically goes from 1898 to 1945, but we find it's a lot easier if we cut it in half. And so tonight we're going to be looking at the first half of period 5, which means we're going to be looking at imperialism, we're going to look at World War I, and we're also going to look at the 1920s. Now, I think tonight might be a little bit shorter than previous reviews just because we have cut the time period in half. And so when I normally have 10, 12 big ideas, tonight I only have 6. So that's what we're going to be looking at. So I'm not going to wait any longer. I said I was going to start at 7. It's 7:01, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I see Mr. Rios is with us. Thank you, sir, for being here, or as he likes to be called, Red 5. We'll just go with that. But let's go. So tonight we're going to look at the big ideas again, 1898 to 1929. And we're going to start with big idea number 1. Once the Western frontier was settled, the United States debated whether it should expand into territories beyond its borders. I'm sure you guys have figured out, expansion is part of the American identity. And, the first half of our history is all about manifest destiny. But once we completed that manifest destiny, the question is, what now? And that's where imperialism is going to come in. So essentially what we're going to look at is we're going to look at why we expanded beyond our borders. Now, we started early. We started in 1867, and we often overlook that. But that's going to be when we annex Alaska into our country, and we're going to purchase Alaska. And it was nicknamed Seward's Folly, because what a lot of people thought was it was just one big polar icebox, and what value could it possibly have to the United States? And I mean, there was some value because we just paid $7.2 million for it. Well, William Seward, the Secretary of State, is going to have the last laugh, because I don't even know if he was alive to see this, I doubt that, but what's going to happen is in 1898, we're going to discover gold up in Alaska, and that's going to be a huge strike for us, and it's going to allow us to, sorry, I'm going to pop this out real quick, and allow us to it's going to help our economy, it's going to help our country, and it's going to give Seward the last laugh with regards to his purchase of Alaska. And that's kind of where we got started with imperialism, although we still aren't in the full swing of it yet. That's going to really start, Frederick Jackson Turner is going to come out also in the 1890s and says that the American frontier is closed. That was his frontier thesis. But we start to look beyond that. We start to look at, where we can find new markets, where we can find new raw materials, and that's going to be our goal. There were 2 competing thoughts when it came to imperialism, and not ironically, they were called the imperialist and the anti-imperialist. Now, when we look at the imperialists, what they're focused on is that economic expansion. They said, we've discovered a lot of raw materials here in our country. We just discovered gold up in Alaska. What other raw materials are out there in the rest of the world that we can bring into our manufacturing genius? Excuse me, I got a little cough tonight, so bear with me. So what we want to do is we want to not only try to go out and exploit new raw materials, but we also want to secure new markets for our manufactured goods, both our manufactured goods and our agricultural goods. And that's the drive. That's one of the reasons we entered into imperialism. Another reason is a term you need to be familiar with, and that's the term social Darwinism. Social Darwinism applied both to politics and economics, and it was this idea that only the strong survive, and it's the natural order of life. And so through natural Darwinism, we as the United States are the stronger, and we should go out and help others as well. it's also going to be some racially motivated tones to why we're going to go into imperialism. Josiah Strong wrote the book Our Country, where he painted this picture of this white Anglo-Saxon race as the pinnacle of evolution. And so that's kind of where we're coming from. But it was also tied to the idea that it was the Christian duty of the American men to go out and spread our message abroad. Not only our message of faith, but also our message of democracy. So what we're doing is going out into the world, and that's what we kind of called white man's burden, that we're going to help elevate others in the world to this great life that we have. And we want others to have that as well. Politically, you're going to see the influence of Alfred Thayer Mahan. He wrote the book, The Influence of Sea Power. And what he's going to say is that you have to have a strong navy to have a strong nation. And he's going to publish that book in 1890, and our Congress is going to take that advice, and they're going to approve the massive construction of steel ships. Because as we expand our markets, we need to be able to, protect our shipping lanes and stuff like that. A strong navy will allow us to do that. And then if you take this just a step further, not only do we need a strong navy to protect our shipping lanes, we need ports along these shipping lanes for refueling, for stocking and stuff like that. So that's going to be another reason for imperialism, is to find more naval ports throughout the country. So if you want just a clear-cut breakdown of imperialism and why we did it, you have to look at expanding our markets, finding new raw materials, social Darwinism, i.e. the white man's burden, and expanding our naval ports. Those are the main reasons for imperialism. And so that's what's pushing this idea that we need to go out and find more lands throughout the world. And Alaska showed us that maybe we can do this. Well, there's these other people that disagree with this idea of imperialism, and they were called the anti-imperialists. And the anti-imperialists are going to make their argument based on several key points. One of them being self-determination, that everybody should have the ability to choose their own form of government, to choose who governs them and how they're going to be governed. That was what colonial America was built on. That's why we went through the American Revolution, because we weren't able to govern ourselves, because England had stepped in and started, overseeing everything that was going on here. And so the anti-imperialists are going to argue that that same thing should be provided for the rest of the people of the world. And for us to go out and just imperialize, we're taking that right away from them. So that's one reason. The other is isolationism. Isolationism has been the forefront of American foreign policy since George Washington gave his farewell address, where he warned America against getting involved in foreign entanglements. And so that's what America has done this whole time, is that they, I lost my train of thought. I saw something about cutting off an ear. But anyway, I totally lost where I was going. So we stayed isolated. As I tell my students, we believe this theory that fish are our friends. As long as we have these two oceans on the side of us, we're safe. We're not going to get involved in all the drama. So let's just stay out of it. And then there was this big question about imperialism as we go out into other areas of the world. What happens as far as the governing, as far as the civil rights of the people we come into contact with? Essentially, does the Constitution follow the flag? And this is where the anti-imperialists kind of show a different side to themselves. Because remember, we're living under this umbrella of social Darwinism. I talked about the fact that Josiah Strong talked about this, Anglo-Saxon white man, that it was the pinnacle of evolution and stuff like that. And so these anti-imperialists are saying, well, if the Constitution is going to follow the flag, then what we're essentially doing is, when we go into some of these countries where there might be people of minority descent living, are we going to give them rights? And I mean, quite honestly, we're not giving them rights here in America, so why would we want to give people in other countries those rights as well? So those are some of the arguments that the anti-imperialists are going to make. But regardless, I mean, you had these two sides. The imperialists are going to be the louder ones. And so we're going to imperialize. We're going to become an imperializing empire. So that's going to take us to big idea number two. Big idea number two is the United States victory in the Spanish-American War led to further land acquisitions and transformed America into a proper empire. So we were eager to expand. And Cuba's just 90 miles away. And Cuba has kind of always been that pie in the sky. Maybe that's the natural place for the United States to expand. But at this time, Cuba is a Spanish imperial colony. And so it's not like they're knocking on our door saying, we want to be annexed into your country. In 1895, the Cuban people are going to revolt against the Spanish government in Cuba. And they're easily going to be put down. And what's going to happen is the Spanish are going to send in General Weyler, and he's going to institute the reconcentration policy in which the rebels and people they thought were guilty of leading this revolution are going to be severely punished, and other people are going to be put into camps, and there's going to be stories of starvation, there's going to be stories of torture, there's going to be stories of rape, and all of that going on in Cuba. Now, at the same time, you have this push in America for imperialism, for expansion. And we also have a circulation war between two major newspapers in our country. One owned by William Randolph Hearst, and the other one owned by type it in there. William Randolph Hearst and Pulitzer. And Pulitzer. And they're competing for circulation, the two biggest newspapers in the world. And they're going to start using what we call yellow journalism. This idea of taking truth and twisting it a little bit to make it a little bit more sellable, if you will. Think the National Enquirer for newspapers at this time. And so we want to create this expose, we want to create this excitement behind different ideas. And so we're going to exaggerate, I think, what's going on down in Cuba at this part, and we're going to exaggerate the atrocities of the Spanish, and we're going to push this idea, or these newspapers are going to push this idea that we need to get involved for humanitarian reasons. America needs to get down into Cuba and help those people. We're not ready to do that. The government's not ready to do that. But what we are ready to do is protect the interests that we have in Cuba. As I'm sure you remember from the Gilded Age, because I know you guys love the Gilded Age, there was a lot of expansion of American businesses into Latin America, into the Caribbean, and other countries down south of, in what we call the American Lake. And in Cuba, we had American farmers and American plantations be operating there. So the United States government is going to send a naval presence into Havana Harbor, into Cuba, just as a show of strength, if you will. Just to say, hey, don't forget, we have interest here in Cuba, and if you start messing with the American economic interest in Cuba, you might have to deal with these naval vessels that are docked at your ports. One of those ships that's going to go in is the USS Maine. So the USS Maine is docked in there, and all of a sudden one day there's this huge explosion, and 200 Americans are going to get killed. Over 200 Americans. And before the investigation can even take place, before any reports even come out, our journalists, Hearst and Pulitzer, are going to start pushing out all these stories that it must be the Spanish. The Spanish must have attacked us. And because of that, that is an act of war. So McKinley is actually going to give, McKinley is the president at this point. He is going to give an ultimatum to the Spanish to back off. And to believe it or not, they actually did a little bit. But still at that point, we're still blaming the Spanish for the explosion of the Maine. And then this letter gets found called the Delome letter. And the Delome letter basically rags out on McKinley, calling him a weak, calling him a coward. And I don't know if that was what put us over the top, but McKinley goes to Congress and asks for a declaration of war, and all of a sudden we're in war with Spain down in Cuba. It was a very short war. We were fighting on two fronts. We fought in Cuba. We also fought in the Philippines because the Philippines were another imperial holding of the Spanish government. Now, Admiral Dewey is going to go into the Philippines and make short work of there when he wins the Battle of Manila. We're going to go into Cuba and we're going to have several battles there. Actually, more men died in the Spanish-American War from disease than did from battle, but we're going to get our war hero out of there. Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders are going to come out as the heroes of the war. Though they actually didn't go up San Juan Hill, they went up Kettle Hill, and they weren't the first ones to go up Kettle Hill. I think it was the 10th Cavalry that went up Kettle Hill, but that doesn't matter because we have a hero, and Americans love our war heroes. In the end, we are going to sign the treaty, and the treaty is essentially going to afford new land holdings to the United States. We're going to get Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and I'll talk about that here in just a few minutes. What we didn't get was Cuba. From the beginning, we said we didn't want Cuba. We had passed the Teller Amendment saying we don't want Cuba. But what we did want is some control. So what we're going to do is Cuba is going to get its independence, but written in their constitution, they have to include what's called the Platt Amendment. And what the Platt Amendment essentially did was it gave the United States the power to intervene to protect our economic interests down in Cuba. I mean, we said things like they couldn't negotiate a treaty without our oversight. We said that they couldn't amass large amounts of debt. We said that if they had any rebellions or something, we had the right to go in and help put the rebellion down. And we established the naval base of Guantanamo Bay on a perpetual lease. That was all in the Platt Amendment. But the bottom line was it was included to protect the economic interest of America in Cuba. So the next thing, as I want to talk about, is I do want to talk about the Philippines, because the Philippines, the people of the island, were excited when they saw America coming in because they thought, all right, we're going to get our independence too, and America's going to help us do it. And when the war was over, imagine their shock when we said, no, you're not ready for independence. You need to be guided. You need to be led. And they're not happy about that at all. In fact, Aguinaldo is going. Who was the president of Philippines at the time, is going to lead a revolt against the American troops, and we're going to be at war with the Philippines for nearly 3 years. And during that time, we're going to see some brutal fighting. We're going to see some very poor activities by some of our U.S. soldiers and stuff like that. In the end, we are going to negotiate a peace, and I believe by that time, Teddy Roosevelt is our president, and he is going to send William Taft to go in and be the territorial governor of the Philippines, and Taft is going to bring in infrastructure, and he's going to start working with developing governments in the Philippines that kind of bring in some of their culture and stuff like that. But it was not pretty. I mean, for 10 years, the actual war went on for about 3 years, but for 10 years, we dealt with revolting Filipinos because they're not happy that they didn't get their independence. We're eventually going to promise them their independence, and they will actually gain their independence on July 4th, 1946. And no, it's not a coincidence that it was July 4th that they got their independence. Now, Ms. Pahovich just put on the screen that the Philippines is located in the South Pacific, close to China. Wouldn't it be kind of cool if we could get our ships all the way to the Philippines without having to worry about fuel or stopping or anything like that? Well, fortunately for us, I have one word to let you know that we were able to do that, and that word is aloha. That's right, Hawaii. At the start of the same year that the Spanish-American War started, which was 1898. That same year, we are going to annex Hawaii. Now, Hawaii had been an independent nation led by Queen Liliuokalani. And what happened was American planters had gone on the island and they staged a coup and they overthrew her. And then once they had control of the island of Hawaii, then they came to the United States and said, hey, annex us, please. And that's what we did. So Hawaii becomes a territory of the United States in 1898, and we immediately established the naval base of Pearl Harbor. And that's going to allow us essentially a way station right in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, so we can go from the United States to Hawaii and then get over to Asia, get to the Philippines, get to China and places like that. And speaking of China, the other part of imperialism, we got to talk about the open door policy. I've mentioned several times that imperialism, economics has a lot to do with that, and we're looking for new markets. There was a fantastic market over in China, and so the United States wants to carve out its own sphere of influence in China. China was kind of like the untouched country leading into this, but the problem is the United States is getting there a little bit late. Queen Liliuokalani was overthrown by the planters on the island of Hawaii, who are going to be led by Sanford Dole. D-O-L-E. That's like Dole pineapple and Dole fruit. That's who it was. And Liliuokalani, just spell it all out. Liliuokalani. Liliuokalani. It just rolls right off the tongue. But anyway, so I want to get back to China. The open door policy. We were late to the game in China. There were European nations that had kind of already carved out their own spheres of influence within China. And we didn't have a sphere, but we wanted one. So what we did was John Hay, the Secretary of State, introduced what was called the open door policy, where we essentially said, hey, why don't we just open up China for trade for everybody? So any country can come in and any country can set up markets in China and everything. It's not like, right, where, okay, England, you have your area. France, you have your area. Japan, you have your area. Russia, let's just let everybody do it. And the spelling counts. I'm gonna make you guys spell that name. Come on, write it 50 times tonight before you go to bed. Anyway, so this open door policy, it was not so much that the European countries said no to the open door policy. It was that they didn't say anything at all. They just kind of ignored it. They just kind of pushed it off. And when they did that, well, we took that as a yes. It's kind of like your parents don't say no. That essentially means yes. Well, the European countries didn't say no, so we took that as yes. And so we're going to go ahead and move into China. Still a little bit difficult because there's some people in China who are not happy about this European influence come in. And that's going to be the harmonious fist of the righteous hands, or the righteous harmonious fist. That was their name, also known as the Boxers. And the Boxers are going to stage a rebellion in China, fighting against the existing regime because of the European influences. Now, the United States is going to lead a coalition of these European forces, but we're going to help bring it together, and we're going to help put the Boxer rebellion down. That's our in China. And that's how we get influence in China. And we start to build a pretty strong alliance with China that's going to carry us over the next 40 years or so. Okay? So there, that big idea number 2, that Spanish-American War is really that catalyst that leads us to imperialism throughout the world. We have, the big areas we got the Philippines, we got Puerto Rico, we got Guam, and then we're getting a lot of other little islands throughout the Pacific. Midway is one that I'm thinking off the top of my head, and places like that. So we are expanding our reach throughout the world. Okay? All right, speaking of going into the world, let's go to big idea number 3. So that's it. I'm going into the new topic now because we're coming out of imperialism. Now we're going into World War I. So here we go. Although the United States began in a position of isolationism regarding World War I, mounting pressure brought them into the war. And the U.S. entry turned the tide of the war for the Allies. Lot going on here, a lot to talk about. Essentially, I'm just going to focus primarily on why the war started, why the United States got involved. Essentially, the war started in July of 1914. Four main reasons that the war started. Get that there's four reasons: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. This is what drove the war to beginning. This is something that was building over in Europe, and we talked about it in class. The assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand is going to be the catalyst that lights this whole thing on fire. As soon as he is assassinated, what's going to happen is the Austrian-Hungarian Empire is going to declare war on Serbia. Because Serbia is friends with Russia, Russia is going to declare war on Austria-Hungary. Because Austria-Hungary has an alliance with Germany, Germany is going to declare war on Russia. Because Russia has an alliance with France, France will declare war on Germany. And because Germany decides it wants to take care of France, they're going to go ahead and try to invade France through Belgium. And when they do that, England's like, you cannot invade Belgium, so we're going to go ahead and declare war on you. And in the meantime, Germany also pairs up with Turkey or the Ottoman Empire, and they declare war on Russia again. Hopefully you got all that. Those are the alliances that were set up in our country or in our world that led to this war. So these four reasons, again, militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. So the war gets started, and you have two sides. You have the Triple Entente, or the Allied powers. The Allied powers are Britain, France, and Russia. On the other side, you have the Central Powers, also known as the Triple Alliance: Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And then later, the Ottoman Empire is going to join them. And the United States is going to stay neutral. We're staying neutral. We don't want to get involved. In fact, we actually tried to play both sides. We thought this was a great economic advantage. You know, we can provide both sides with, you know, weapons and money and stuff like that. And our banks here in the United States started loaning money to some of the warring powers. Eventually, all of that's going to go towards the Allies. But initially, we tried to dole it out a little bit to both sides, because why not? Well, the United States had a difficult time staying out of the war. During those first 2 years of the war, while it's being fought to a stalemate over in Europe, what we have is the Germans have built this really good submarine fleet. And this submarine fleet is patrolling off the shores of the Allied powers, and they're shooting any ship that they deem as a threat, possibly carrying weapons or anything like that. In 1915, one of those ships is going to be the Lusitania, an English cruise ship. But there were Americans on board the ship. Now, make no mistake, Woodrow Wilson, president at the time, he's pissed off. He's angry about this, but he's not going to take any action because we don't want to get involved in this war. But then the Germans kept sinking U.S. ships as time went on. After a while, they're going to back off a little bit. They're going to sign the Sussex Pledge. And the Sussex Pledge is going to be promises where they're not going to shoot out, we're not going to shoot civilian ships until we get women and the children the time to get off, and this, that, and the other thing. But after a while, the Germans said, this is just boring. We're in war. We should have the right to attack, whatever. And so they're going to start engaging again in unrestricted submarine warfare. And that will include some U.S. ships that are going to be sunk. Now, we're starting to talk about the possibility of getting involved in this war. In fact, we get to the point where we say we're going to cut off all diplomatic. If Germany, if you're going to keep shooting our ships, we're going to cut off all diplomatic ties to Germany. And that's usually the last step before you get involved in war. But we still hadn't declared war. What's going to put us over the top, and the third reason that's going to lead the United States to join the war, is going to be the Zimmerman telegram. The Zimmerman telegram, or the Zimmerman note, is a note that was sent by Germany to Mexico with the intent of Mexico going to war against the United States to keep us busy over here in the Western Hemisphere so we don't get involved in the war over in Europe. Now, what Germany promised Mexico? They can have all the land back that they lost in the Mexican-American War. Viva Mexico! Let's do it. Well, it didn't happen. We don't know what would have happened because the telegram was intercepted. And when we found out about it, that's when we got our official declaration of war against Germany. And so the United States is now involved in World War I. The problem is when we declared war in April of 1917, we weren't prepared to go to war. Our military had been cut back. We didn't, a lot of our, we weren't at full wartime production in our factories and stuff like that. So it's going to take us about 8 to 10 months to be ready to send full units of troops over to Europe. Now we are going to send over John J. Pershing, General Pershing, and the Expeditionary Force, and they're going to bide some time. They're going to help plug some holes in the Western Front and stuff like that. But it's not going to be until we get, we start sending hundreds of thousands of men over that we really start to make a difference. What you also need to know, and I don't know if I was going to talk about it here, I think I might talk about it on the next one, is America is going to take this total war stance where we're going to get the entire U.S. society involved in fighting this war. What happens is when we finally get over there, we were really, once we got there, while we got there late, and like I tell my students, we got there with 2 minutes to go in the fourth quarter. But us arriving in Europe is going to absolutely tip the scales to the Allies. And it's going to give them that victory. Remember, in 1917, just before we declared war, you had the Bolshevik Revolution. And Russia had already signed a treaty with Germany, the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, which Russia was now out of the war. And so all Germany had to focus on was that one front, their western, all quiet on the east, on the western front. That's all they had to focus on. And so America arriving is going to give that boost that the Allied powers need to win this war. Okay, so while we got there late, we got there in time, if that makes sense. At the end of this war, we're going to sign the Treaty of Versailles. Now, remember, going into negotiations at Versailles, Britain and France wanted revenge and money. They looked to Germany as the cause of this war, and they said, somebody has to pay the price, and you're it, Germany. And so that's their goal. Woodrow Wilson has a completely different viewpoint. Woodrow Wilson is going to go in because he wants to go in and create a plan to prevent war in the future. So that's where his 14 points is coming in, is to go in and create peace without claiming victory. To go in and say, if we all agree to this, we can all live in peace. And it's not about blame or anything like that. It's about living together. And that's what his 14 points were all about. But And when you look at the key parts of his 14 points, there were several key goals he had. Number one, he wanted freedom of the seas. Ships should be able to sail wherever they need without having to worry about getting shot by submarines. That's what he says, freedom of the seas. Second is he wants the self-determination of all nations. Again, that idea that we can choose the government we want, and all nations should be able to do that. And then finally, he wanted a League of Nations. A League of Nations that would be an organization that would help negotiate problems between countries throughout the world without using war. So that's the goal of the 14 points that Wilson's going to show. But what's going to happen is you have Great Britain, you have France, who have Article 231 saying Germany is completely responsible for all of this. And then you have Wilson over here saying, I got this 14-point plan for peace and everything's going to be good. And the fighting is kind of going on. And kind of a little bit of trivia here, during these debates and during these, arguments of what to do, Wilson's going to get the Spanish flu. And he's going to be knocked out. And so he's not going to have the energy to keep fighting and everything. And so eventually what's going to happen is the treaty's going to be signed. Article 231 will be included. That is, it has Germany taking the blame. And we're also going to include the 14 points. Now, real quickly, I'm going to be honest, this is not on your test, but Germany taking the blame. The extent of this was unbelievable. They had to pay like $33 billion in reparations. And literally, guys, they just finished paying that off within the last 10 years. They also had to completely decimate their military. They had next to nothing once it was all done. They lost land. They had a demilitarized zone between them and France. I mean, they paid the price for this. And like you've said, it's gone a couple times in here. It's going to tick Germany off. because Germany is now going to hit, the Great Depression is going to hit Germany before it hits anybody, and it's going to hit them hard, and the people are going to be struggling, the people are going to be starving, and they're going to be angry about the war loss. They're going to be angry that their lands have been lost. I mean, they had people who lived in Germany who now live in Czechoslovakia just because someone moved a line. They're going to be mad that they don't have a military to defend them. And so all this anger, all this hurt, all this fear and lack of hope is going to set the stage for Adolf Hitler to come in and say, hey, I got you. I'll take care of you. Trust me. And when someone comes and sells something like that, when you're scared and you're hopeless, you're going to buy anything that they're selling. And so that's why we say the Treaty of Versailles is the first step to World War II. But that's our next review. So let's get back to the Treaty of Versailles. So it's signed. Wilson comes back, and here's what he's got to do. He's got to get Congress to ratify the treaty. But Congress had a real problem with that League of Nations. They didn't like it. They didn't like that somebody else had sovereignty and somebody else could actually pull us into a war without our approval. Remember, if we go to war, Congress has the authority to declare war. That's their responsibility. Article 10 of the League of Nations Covenant essentially said that the League had the power to regulate who would fight in wars if war were to come. So we were essentially giving up our sovereignty. And so Wilson's going to have to come back. He's going to try to sell this to the Congress. They're not buying it. The irreconcilable said there is no way we're signing off on this treaty. He's going to then take it to the people of America. While he's traveling the country, he's going to end up having a stroke, and he's not going to be able to perform his duties as president anymore. So his wife Edith is going to be in the background kind of running things, like the wizard behind the curtain. Pay no attention to the woman behind the curtain. But she was running the country the last few months of Wilson's presidency. But the United States never signed off on the Treaty of Versailles. The League of Nations was formed, but without the United States, it didn't have the strength to survive. And so once World War II happens, it just completely dissolves. Okay? All right. So let's go here to big idea number 4. Because what's going on here at home? U.S. involvement in World War I meant leveraging all of its assets at home. Additionally, it created the occasion for the suppression of civil liberties, nativisms, and significant migrations. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, America went into what was called total war status, meaning that we're going to mobilize our economy, we're going to mobilize our industry, and we're going to mobilize our society, all of those resources in order to win this war. Congress is going to create several wartime agencies that are going to make sure that this all comes together. One of them is the War Industries Board. The War Industries Board worked with labor and management that kept the factories running to stop employees or stop workers from going on strike during the war. You're going to see the Food Administration being created. The Food Administration is going to make sure there's enough food for the troops and the Americans. You're also going to have, and I'm drawing a blank on the name, and I'm sure Ms. Pahovich or Mr. Rios will get it in there, but the Creole organization, who their job was to sell the war, whether it's through propaganda posters or the 4-Minute Men or stuff like that. That was their job with regards to the war. And so, I mean, we looked at a lot of different propaganda posters. Remember, the job of the propaganda posters, they were trying to do several things. Number 1, keep up recruitment. Number 2, get people to conserve. They wanted people to help finance the war, so buy war bonds and stuff like that. And then finally, the last one is to dehumanize the enemy. And so you see that in a lot of the posters and everything. And I'm drawing a blank on the group that did it. It's the I want to say the Communications Board, but that's not what it was. But it was Creel who he created that, or he ran that organization. So look that up because that might be something you need to know. Here's the other thing that started happening is that we wanted people to get into this war. We wanted people to enlist. We did institute a draft. We had the 1917 Selective Service Act, but we did have people who were against the war. And we wanted to prevent them from convincing other people not to get involved. And so what you're going to see happening is we're going to pass laws that restrict civil liberties. And I'm speaking specifically about the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act. What the Espionage Act did is it made it illegal to interfere with any military operations. Yeah, it's the Creel Committee. That's who I'm thinking of, but I'm trying to remember what their actual name of the agency was. But it was the Creel Committee. That's it exactly. So anyway, the Espionage Act of 1917 essentially stops anybody from interfering with military operations, including a recruitment and enlistment. And then you also had this, you had the Sedition Act. And the Sedition Act made it illegal to speak negatively about the government or the war effort or anything like that. There are going to be people that challenges it. The one I'm going to talk to you about is Schenck in the Supreme Court case of Schenck versus United States. Schenck and his socialist buddies, there we go, the Committee on Public Information. That's the one. Thank you so much. Schenck versus the United States. Schenck and his socialist buddies started to print up a bunch of leaflets that were anti-war, anti-enlistment, encouraging men to ignore their draft notices and stuff like that. They started handing them out. They put them out through the mail, and he is going to be arrested under the Espionage Act of 1917. It's going to go all the way to the Supreme Court, and what the Supreme Court is going to rule in Schenck versus the United States is this, that freedom of speech is not absolute. And the government can limit our civil liberties if there is clear and present danger in our world. So during wartime, our government has the authority to limit our civil rights. And like Oliver Wendell Holmes said, freedoms are not absolute. And the example we always talk about with this is you cannot walk into a crowded theater and falsely yell fire, because that will cause a panic, that will cause danger, that you don't have the freedom of speech to do that. So our freedoms are limited to a point, but during war, government does have the authority to restrict our freedoms in order to protect us from clear and present danger. So that was the big thing. You're also going to see during this time is you're going to see this growing anti-communist movement in our country. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, 1917, you had the Bolshevik Revolution, you had the overthrow of the Tsar in Russia, and you have Lenin come in, and now they're a communist country and all this other stuff, and we're afraid that that's going to come here, and xenophobia, fear of immigrants and stuff like that starts to rise in our country. And so what's going to happen is we are going to start what's known as the Red Scare. This fear of communism, this fear of how it could come here. And we're seeing some parallels between what happened in the Soviet Union and what's happening in the United States, specifically our labor unions and strikes. We're also going to see riots. We're going to see during this time, and I'm going to talk about this in a few minutes, but during this time, you're going to see a migration of African Americans to northern cities for jobs during the war. And this is going to lead to competition in these cities for homes and for jobs. And in 1920, 1921, you're going to see a series of race riots. And these race riots are going to occur in Chicago. They're going to occur in Boston. And one of the biggest ones is going to occur in Tulsa, the Tulsa race riot, where nearly 400 African Americans are killed. The black community is completely destroyed. And these riots are just another piece of the puzzle of, how our society is being influenced and possibly fallen apart because of communist influence. And so A. Mitchell Palmer is going to put together a crusade against socialists in our country. Another thing that's going on I didn't mention is that there were a series of mail bombs being sent to different government agents throughout the country. And these bombs were being sent in the mail with the intent of destruction. And Palmer's house actually got hit by one of those bombs. And so he's going to put together this group of men and crusade to go out and rid our country of socialists, radicals, labor union leaders, whoever we think could enter into or lead us into a communist takeover. And what's going to happen is they're going to have over 6,000 people arrested. Now, like I said, socialist radicals and labor union leaders, 6,000 are going to be arrested, 500 deportations, people just kicked out of the country because we were afraid of what could happen, that xenophobia, that fear of immigrants coming in. And the specific immigrants we are targeting, and I should mention this, the ones from Southern and Eastern Europe. So Russia, Italy, Greece, this area right here where socialism was so strong. And so that's who we're going to target. You're also going to see the rise of nativism in our country. This is something we've dealt with before. I mean, we had, nativism in the 1840s, and then we saw nativism again in the 1880s, and here we are in the 1920s, and we got the rise of nativism again. And this nativism is going to lead to some legislation by our Congress, specifically dealing with immigration. And that's going to be the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and the National Origins Act of 1924. Simply, the difference between the two is the Emergency Quota Act set a 3% limit of immigrants coming from each individual country based on the census of 1910. So they're going to look at the census of 1910 and say, we got this many people who came from this country, so from now on, we're only going to let 3% of that number in through our gates. The problem with the Emergency Quota Act is it didn't target the people that we wanted to keep out, and that was the people from Southern and Eastern Europe. So that's when the National Origins Act is going to be passed in 1924 that said we're going to reduce the limit to 2% and we're going to base that number on the 1890 census. And what you have to know is 1890 is roughly when that wave of new immigrants start coming into our country. So there were very few people from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe prior to 1890. So that's going to limit how many come in from that region. And that's the region we want to target. Also Asia as well. That's going to keep a lot of Asians out as well. We had the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. So in 1890, that census is not going to show many Asians coming in at all. I should point out, just, little trivia here, during that same time, we had unlimited immigration allowed from the Western Hemisphere of the United States. So if you were coming from Mexico, if you were coming from Central America, if you were coming from South America, you're welcome. Come on in. So there you go. Let's see. What am I missing? The Great Migration. That's the one I want to talk about. I mentioned just a minute ago about the migration of African Americans from the South to the North. And a lot of it where they're being drawn by jobs, they're being drawn by the more advantageous education, but they're also being pushed out by what's going on in the southern states. We're still under Jim Crow laws, so there's still lynching going on. There's still they're terrorizing the people. There's mistreatment. There's a lot of bad stuff. So we're out. We're going north, and so they're going to start this great migration to the north, to the northern cities, where hundreds of thousands of African Americans are going to go north. But as I told my students today, don't think that when they got to the north that it was all tulips and roses. There was still a ton of discrimination in the north, as evidenced by the race riots that we're going to see in 20 and 21, also known as the Red Summer. And the only difference between what's going on in the north and what's going on the south is in the south, this discrimination has been ingrained into those Jim Crow laws. And so that's, so there's a legal mechanism that they're stuck in the South, where in the North, you still had also huge discrimination stuff going on, but it wasn't codified like it was in the South. Okay? All right. So that's big idea number 4. Now let's go to big idea number 5. Big idea number 5. But in the 1920s, or in the 20s, new technologies focused on the U.S. economy on production of consumer goods, which improved standards of living and spread national culture. Guys, it's known as the Roaring Twenties. I mean, you can come up with all sorts of causes for why it was called the Roaring Twenties. I mean, we're coming out of World War I. Businesses are booming. The standard of living for most Americans is going to go up during the 1920s, and a lot of it has to do with the things that are mentioned here in Big Idea number 5. So what we have here is, we got to look at the causes and effects of innovations in communication and technology in the U.S. over time. Henry Ford, in the early 1900s, created the Model T Ford, and he's also going to create that assembly line process of building and manufacturing goods. And we got to give Ford a lot of credit. And basically, that assembly line is simply put, I'm going to put this bolt in this hole every single day. That's all I do. This bolt into this hole, this bolt into this hole. And then the guy next to me, he's going to put the next bolt in, and so on. And you're going to have this long assembly line process. And what this does is it decreases the cost of production. And it replaces skilled workers, and so you can pay a lot less for unskilled workers. But it's also going to make products more affordable for the American people. Now, the assembly line was already pretty efficient, but then when Frederick Turner, and he's going to introduce this principle of scientific management, and what they're going to do is literally, they are going to go into the factories with stopwatches, and they're going to time how long each process along the assembly line takes, and then they're going to find a faster way to do it. So that's even going to speed up manufacturing even more. And so the efficiency of the assembly line is going to become even more extreme. And like I said, that's going to make American products much cheaper. And so we're not just talking about cars, although as we go into the 20s, more Americans can afford a car because they're a lot less expensive to buy, but they're also going to be able to buy all sorts of other consumer goods that are now being produced that they've never had before. And washing machines and toasters and coffee pots and stoves and vacuum cleaners and sewing machines. I'm just throwing stuff out that's going to make their lives that much easier. And so as the American standard of living starts to increase, a lot of that is going to be spurred on by all this new technology that's going to come in. On top of that, we're also going to see this whole new way of purchasing. It's called credit. You can buy these goods on an installment plan. You don't have $5 for your toaster today. Don't worry. Give me 50 cents and you can make payments to me every week. And so Americans started buying stuff on time. And that became a norm. And then the more goods we made, the more competition there was for these goods. So then you started seeing advertising, and marketing became very popular during this time. And we went beyond just the catalog shopping. Now we're advertising on radio, and we're advertising in newspapers and all this other stuff. And we see this rise of popular culture in our society. And it's going to be spurred on by the radio and by movies. And what we're going to see, the radio is going to become central to American life during this time. And, they're like in 1923, there are nearly 600 radio broadcasts going on. And we're going to have not just like music and news, but we're going to have shows. Like one of the most famous shows during the time was Amos and Andy, kind of taking that stage show from vaudeville and putting it on the radio. And people would that every night shows would come on at certain times, and they would go and listen to the radio. And what we started to see was that Americans were becoming closer because they were starting to share a common interest. And what we heard on the radio and then what we saw in the movies started to define this picture of an American culture. We started to be able to emphasize what an American culture looked like. The movies, we had silent movies at the beginning of the 1920s, but in 1927, we're going to have our very first talking picture, The Jazz Singer, starring Al Jolson. And so the regional differences that we have in our country kind of start to alleviate a little bit because we're all listening to the same shows and we're all seeing the same movies, and we're realizing, we have a lot in common, and so that's going to bring our country closer together. But there are going to be people left out. because, and I'm speaking specifically about Black Americans and rural Americans, because when they see these pictures up on the screen, when they hear these stories on the radio, they recognize that they're distinct and they're different from what's being presented. And then you're going to start seeing kind of offshoots of our culture to appease to those people. One example of that is going to be the Harlem Renaissance up in New York. And I think I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. But when I say that the radio is going to bring America closer together, is because the radio and movies, again, are creating this vision of what the American culture is and what the American culture should look like. I hope that makes sense, okay? All right, so that takes us to our last big idea, which is big idea number 6. Big idea number 6, the urbanization of America granted new opportunities for women and immigrants, gave rise to new forms of arts, and emphasized regional differences. Let's see. We did have our cultural, we did have our political controversies during this time. Don't think that everything was just, tulips and tiptoeing and all that other stuff. Half Americans lived in the city at this point, and women and immigrants and migrants are starting to come into the cities as well. So there's going to be competition for jobs and everything. When it comes to women are going to have more opportunities to work. They're going to come in, and these are going to be young single women. These are not married women. If you were married, most of these jobs you were not allowed to have these jobs. I spoke in one class about my grandmother. My grandmother was a teacher in Nevada, and my grandfather worked for the silver mines there. And it was illegal for her to be a teacher and to be married. So they actually, I believe, hid their marriage for a while. But there were jobs for women during this time. And so you're going to see this independent movement for young women, I would say late teens to early 20s, where they could go in the cities and they can get a job as secretaries or in teaching or nurses. They also got some jobs as unskilled labor in the factories and stuff. And I talked about that in class today. They didn't get paid as much, but they could get those jobs. You also had the immigrants coming in. I've already talked about the rise of nativism during this time. But basically, we have that's what's going on throughout all this. And I just realized I talked about everything I was going to talk about here with immigrants. I talked about it with the big idea, but you got the idea. So make sure you understand that. But I do want to talk about, the women having these new roles in society. As Ms. Pahovich mentioned, the advertising that we saw during the 1920s started to focus towards women, started to focus for the women in the homes, because it's not, you kind of got your credibility in society based on what you had in your home. And if, does Miss Jones have the brand new, Westinghouse toaster in her home? Why don't you? And so women became more of the focus of some of the economics in our country at this point. They also did, like I say, start to develop their own identity, especially these young independent women, and we're talking about the flappers. They were the symbol of women's liberation. These women were the precursor to the women's lib movement that we're going to see in the 1960s and stuff like that. And the flappers, just think of everything as shorter. Their hair got shorter, their dresses got shorter, they drank, they smoked, they had a good time, they were going to live it up while they're young, but they still had the idea that they would marry and have children. This was not like they were going to live this independent life for forever. This was just one step of their life, but it is the beginning of this women's independence movement. I mentioned a few minutes ago about talking about the Great Migration. There was a lot of internal migration within our country. And as I mentioned, the Harlem Renaissance. You saw African Americans moving into the industrial centers of the North, trying to escape the oppression of the South. And one area they went was Harlem, New York. And what happened in Harlem was incredible. We had this revival of arts and intellectual pursuits of these migrants coming in, and we're going to be introduced to all sorts of new cultural things of Black America that are going to become part of the American culture as well. Music is especially a big one. Jazz and the blues are going to be introduced through the Harlem Renaissance. I mentioned that jazz came out of New Orleans, but through the Great Migration made its way up to Harlem. And so you're going to have people like Duke Ellington and and Louis Armstrong and others who are going to spread that music throughout the country. Writing, Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, they're going to put words to the Black experience in the United States. And all of that's going to happen because of the Great Migration, because of the migration through the United States. We also are going to have what's known as the Lost Generation during this time. The Lost Generation, this term came about from Gertrude Stein, and we're going to see a lot of our writers at the time, like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Hemingway and T.S. Eliot and others. They're going to be writing about the pervasive materialism within the United States and how we are wasting, in World War I, we wasted life and we wasted resources fighting a war, and we're not really sure why we fought that war. And they're going to kind of lambast the society and the direction that we're going. And a lot of their writings, like The Great Gatsby and I'm drawing a blank on Hemingway's novel. I can't think of the name. He had several, but I'm drawing a blank on it. I think I'm drawing a blank. I can see the cover. But this lost generation is mirroring what they see as the failure of our society because of all this materialism, because of all this consumerism and production and all this other stuff. Then finally, we're going to have conflict between urban and rural Protestants. We're going to see rural Protestants who are more seen as the fundamentalists, who see they condemn the degradation of the morals in our society, maybe some of the actions that we're seeing of the young men and women in the cities and stuff like that. And they believed in the inerrancy or the truth of the Bible. And they believed they were very, very serious about what the Bible said and what they read in the Bible. And they understood, a lot of people want to say that they took the literal meaning from every single word in the Bible, but that's a stretch. What they believed was you take every word in the Bible seriously. Well, at the same time, you have these modernists who are, talking about these new ideas of Darwinism and evolution and stuff like that. And so this conflict between the urban and the rural Protestants, or the modernists and the fundamentalists, are going to come to head at the Scopes Monkey trial, where it was this idea of creation versus evolution. And evolution, it was illegal to teach in the schools. And the ACLU is going to bring John Scopes into the picture, and Scopes is going to go into a school in Tennessee and teach evolution, knowing that it was against the law. He's going to be convicted. He's going to go on trial. It's going to be Clarence Darrow is going to be hired by the ACLU to defend him, and William Jennings Bryan is going to present the case for the state. And this courtroom drama is going to play out on the radios across the country. Very similar, like I mentioned in class today, the Murdoch trial. You could watch that right now on TV. That's kind of what the Scopes Monkey trial was like in the 1920s. In the end, Scopes is going to be convicted, but that conviction is going to be overturned based on a technicality. Modernism, they're going to say that they triumphed over the view of fundamentalism, but the debate still lingers today. But that was another debate, another conflict during this time of the 1920s. And that's it. So basically, what we're looking at here is 6 big ideas that we just went through, essentially spanning from 1898 to imperialism all the way up to right about 1929. So through the 1920s, but right up to, I would say, right before Hoover gets elected. And that's our next unit. That's the Great Depression. But that's where we're at now. So pretty much that's it. So what questions? I know you guys, I've seen the chat going on there. I don't even know what time it is. About an hour. I did okay. So that was, everything I needed to cover. What questions or anything do you guys have that we can answer for you before we call it a night? And yes, I know you guys are going to put there, the dogs will be here. Flynn is asleep under my chair right now. So, all right. All right, nothing. Let's see. No questions coming through. Oh, not my pleasure. I enjoy doing this. So, all right. All right, so we got Miss Pahovich selling breakfast with the professor tomorrow. So, I guess we don't have any more questions. So I guess I can try to get the dogs over here and see if they'll jump up here. Flynn, you want to come say hello? Or Gilligan, you want to come say hello? Oh, they're being shy. Come here, boys. Come here, Flynn. All right. Come on, bub. Up. Come here. Up. Come here. Come on. Come here. Get up here. Get up here. Come here. Up. Okay, camera down. Camera down. There's Flynn. He's got his teddy bear. Say hello. Got my bear. Yeah. Say go study for your test. Yeah. All right. Good boy. Good boy. All right, let me see if I can get Gilligan. Oh, Gilligan, come here. Come here, sweetheart. Come here. Gilligan's getting brave. Come here. Come here. Gilligan, come here. Well, Flynn's now hogging the camera. Come here, Gil. Come here. All right. Yeah, look at that. Look at Flynn. All right, here's Gilligan. There's Gilligan. You see Gilligan? He's right here. Yeah, here's Gilligan. Here's my Gilly. All right, there they are. Here's Gil. They got them both here. Yeah. Gilligan. Hey, Gil. Gil. There we go. Smile for him. There we go. Oh, Gilligan. Yes. Gilligan likes to cuddle. All right, there we go. All right, so that's the boys. That's me. That's going to do it for us this evening. I appreciate you guys joining us. I hope you got some stuff that it's going to help you on the test. Remember, the test tomorrow is 35 stimulus-based multiple choice questions. If you're in mine or Miss Pahovich's class, if any of Mr. Rios' students are working or watching, I don't know what your test is going to be, but I'm sure it's covering the same topics. I want to thank Miss Pahovich. I want to thank Mr. Rios for joining us in the chat tonight. Hopefully you guys have a fantastic evening. Tomorrow's Thursday. That means we're only one day away from Friday, which means the weekend's coming. But until then, guys, we will see you later. Again, thanks for watching. Next time, in a few weeks, we'll be doing World War II and the Great Depression. But that's for another day. Bye-bye.